Hello and welcome from Amsterdam. I am Aravni Yassian and I'm your moderator of this session and now introducing your speaker. You chose to enter this session what's about bringing the heart back in law firms. This keynote is based on academic research of Els Boonacker. And part of the INSEAD Executive Master in Change. Els is fellow at Filion Governance and Leadership, and she did this extensive research and now bringing the heart back in law firms. So about this session, it's really my pleasure to introduce Els to you, as we are also collaborating on bringing the heart back in business. So, a big hand for Els, and Els, the stage is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I come from a family of lawyers, and I had the privilege of attending an international school when I was younger. And at the international school, I learned from and had classes with all these amazing humans from around the world. So it wasn't really a surprise that when I went to university, that I studied international human rights. I wanted to put my heart into working at protecting the fundamental human rights of all those amazing humans around the world that I had met in my school time. Fast forward 5 years later, and I wasn't working at the UN like I thought, or maybe the European Court of Human Rights. Instead, I was working at the leading law firm in the Netherlands, working around the clock on M&A deals. Multi-billion-dollar, complex, cross-border, bespoke, all those type of M&A deals and all kinds of big words I used to explain to myself that the work I was doing was still really meaningful. But in fact, my heart was not really in my work. It wasn't there, and I'm not sure if it ever was there. And I saw the same, or at least I thought I saw the same in those amazing humans that I worked with there, because there were a lot of amazing humans in my law firm as well. Just to be sure, when we start, this is not a speech against corporate law firms or big law firms. On the contrary, it's my take based on my research on how what's going on in those firms today, how we can better understand it, and also become aware of what's going on beneath the surface of those firms at the unconscious level, and how that unconscious level impacts behavior and dynamics in the firm, and that how it gets into the way of creating system change at those firms. And that's about law firms. I did my study on law firms, but it's actually applicable to all organizations, all groups of people that are working together. And looking at the unconscious things, the things beneath the surface, can sometimes be difficult and painful. But if we do that, if we acknowledge that that aspect is there, we become aware, we do the real heart work that we need to do, we can drive change. We can help create a world where everyone can bring their heart to their work. And that is what I think should be the new normal. So I was an M&A lawyer for 10 years, and later I became head of human resources and head of the management team at the same firm. And in both those roles at the firm, I noticed a lot of paradoxes. And paradoxes always spark my curiosity, because it gives me a question to understand what is really going on. Because if things are straightforward, for example, if you want to manifest change at a law firm, you actually know what you want to change. Why don't you just do it? Lawyers they know quite well what things are wrong within their firms. They know quite well how they would otherwise do it, but sometimes, or actually often, they're not able to actually make that change happen. And paradoxes can be a way that draw our attention to these things. It's an invitation to learn what's really going on, even if it's not visible to the clear eye. And again, this is applicable to law firms, but also to any organizations. So to shed new light on these recognizable challenges that law firms face and the changes that they want to go through, I used what's called the system psychodynamic perspective to look at what's going on. It's a way to look beneath the surface of law firms, in a way to put night vision goggles on. And suddenly things become visible to you that were not visible to you before. And system psychodynamic thinking is a combination of using psychoanalytic ideas to understand the significance of the unconscious on individual behavior, then extending those ideas to group dynamics and to understand what really goes on in groups, and then placing that in systemic thinking and looking at the law firm as a system and to understand the interplay of parts of that whole. And to get my information, I interviewed 30 people across law firms in different roles in different tenures, and I also did a lot of research on the different elements. And this is what I found. I won't be able to fit everything I found into 15 minutes, but I'll give you some highlights of my studies. I found there's recurring characteristics across individual lawyers, groups, and law firms. And there's both the conscious and the known aspects of that, and then there's the unconscious impact on behavior or on groups or on the system. And I want to, before I start going into the examples, the known things, the things we are aware of, are often also the things we're proud of, the things that we put forward ourselves. And then the more unconscious things are the things that are maybe not the things we're as proud of, because they come from a more emotional state. Especially lawyers who are very head-based and very rational, and they want to argument for to make sense when they're pleading or when they're negotiating. They want to understand everything that's going on. It's sometimes harder to accept that there's also a world that's less easy to understand and definitely less rational as well. So then if we look on the side of the rational and the known, lawyers are often very bright and they're very driven, very ambitious, known to work hard, play hard, and also proclaim that a lot. But at the same time, if you look at them closely, they're also cautious, conservative, and maybe even pessimistic. And that comes from their job of being, in a way, professional risk seekers, where the client, who's the entrepreneur, is often looking for opportunities. It's the job of the lawyer to look for risks, just seek out risks. And that job, the professional programming that the lawyer has, can carry on to other aspects of that lawyer's life. So definitely also that lawyer's life inside of the firm. Then when lawyers advise their clients, they typically like to have an air of knowing it all and also being able to do it all. They're proud of that. They work very hard at it. But at the same time, there's some type of permanent anxiety inside of them about their own performance in the firm and in the up or out system, if they'll survive the next evaluation, or if their performance is on par with their other partners. Sometimes they're referred to as insecure overachievers. And then there's another paradox. They're a master with words. They can interrogate any witness. But at the same time, they have difficulty having open and honest conversations with other partners of their firm. They don't, for some reason, carry the mastery they have with their words into those conversations. And a final example, at the individual level, lawyers, of course, by their job, have to gather evidence. They're very skilled at finding this everywhere to argument the case. But then on the more unconscious level, or at least what you see them doing in their behavior internally, is they don't gather evidence at all. They typically act in a lot of their internal interactions from their own assumptions about others, and they don't actually test those assumptions. So as an example, I spoke to a former managing partner, and he said, when there were emotions at play or potentially emotions at play, he could feel his body responding to that. There's an anxiety in his body for situations in which people may be emotional. And he said at first that was actually for him a reason to often step away from the situation. And he had trained himself to actually read that anxiety as an invitation to step into a situation. But that was a new learned behavior, which was not his classical behavior or how he would respond to emotions. And another example I heard was two partners who actually had almost a 20-year conflict within their firm, who actually sat in the offices next to each other and would send really angry emails to each other almost on a daily basis, rather than just stepping into the office next door and actually having a heart-to-heart conversation. Another paradox I found is that there's a high degree of homogeneity across lawyers. They say they're very collegial, and they're also inward looking. So they're really focused around the group. They're often, I'd say, confident to the extent of arrogant about the performance of their own firm. So it sounds like they would be very happy to be with the firm and the group of partners that they are. But at the same time, the culture internally in the firm can be very transactional. There's low tolerance on subpar performance, and there's even a tendency to catch each other out on subpar performance. And then finally, something that's evident in many law firms is the remuneration scheme. So if in the case of a lockstep scheme, every partner gets paid the same amount in an effort to focus on collaboration rather than internal competition. And in theory, of course, that works. And in reality, it works to extent, but it also makes partners equal where they're not. So you're rewarding them on equal levels, but they're doing unequal performances. And what you see is that inequality in performance comes out in different places than in the remuneration. So they, in the informal hierarchy, and which partners are actually dictating what happens in the firm, is often the high revenue gathering partners, or the rainmakers, have a lot of influence in the firm. So this is to show what are the more visible and the less visible sides of what's going on in life in law firm. And my study zoomed in on law firm leadership specifically, and what law firm leadership can do to make change. And when I started the investigation, I thought there would be some very clear things going forward that they needed to do, but I also found that a lot of the information was already present in the mind of the people I interviewed. So that the reason that they were actually not manifesting that change was for other reasons. And that I found was lack of awareness of these subconscious or unconscious things going on at their individual level or in their teams or in their firm as a whole. So I zoomed in on that from the system psychodynamic perspective on law firm leadership. And I found that there were some elements that are very important to take on board when you want to manifest change in this setting, even though they're difficult and painful to acknowledge. So there's another big paradox at the level of law firm leadership, because lawyers by nature are very independent and autonomous, but the partners together are the owners of the firm. So they need each other for each other's success. And they rely on keeping that group together. And in research by John Morley, that's been called the bonding capital of the firm. And the bonding capital, when it's kept together, is great because it generates the success for the firm. But it's also, there's a risk when it gets severed that the firm actually collapses. And Morley actually says they go up in flames, they collapse into smoking ruins. And maybe you know the examples of American firms, Dewey and LaBeouf and Howry, that in a matter of days actually went from financially very solvent and very successful to non-existent. So partners leaving the firm is a big risk within law firms, and especially for the leadership. You have to manage against risks. The biggest risk, of course, is the rainmakers, the high revenue and also high reputation partners of the firm. And in fact, some partners that sat on a management board of a firm entrusted me saying that a lot of the work they were doing was actually protecting partners leaving, because there's a permanent risk that if they didn't create a counterforce for these partners leaving, that actually the firm would not exist. It would go up in flames in 6 months. So this is a protection against a risk. And in psychoanalytic terms, we call this the primary risk. And a way of protecting against that risk is to also not consciously, so it's, I say create, but we create it together in a subconscious collusive way, but there are social defenses. So the risk creates an anxiety, and as a response to the anxiety, what people, when they're gathered together, whether it's a law firm or another organization, they develop social defenses. And that can be any policy or structure or anything in the culture of a firm that is basically a defense mechanism against the anxiety that's caused by the risk. So it goes it's a little too deep to go into much detail, but I hope this is sufficient for you to understand that when you're on the board of a law firm and you feel that the worst thing that could happen to you is that partners start leaving, all you start doing unconsciously, because often it's not really in the world of consciousness, is based around making sure people don't leave. And what's happened is that this social defense, this defense mechanism in firms, has found the trend of financialization, which is a trend going on worldwide, whether it's at state level or it's at organizational level, where the narratives have become much more financialized, and where financial metrics are basically dictating a lot of strategic decisions in organizations. And it's happened also in law firms. And many of you who work in law firms will probably recognize that over the past 2 decades or something, KPIs and dashboards and metrics have much more crept into the world of law firms as well. It's also increased the financial performance of many law firms. So it's not something to necessarily see as something negative if you're one of the partners also reaping the benefits of the increased financial performance. But what it's also done, it's overshadowed more traditional lawyer values. So there's a shift taking place from professional fiduciary values that are associated with reputation, autonomy, expertise, and also the ethos of public service. And it's shifting to more commercial market logistics, which is more the self-interested pursuit of increasing profit and shareholder value. So these things have collided. Financialization is something that's happening in the world, but it's also something that many leaders in law firms have kind of grabbed onto, also again, not consciously, but as a way to defend against the anxiety they feel of their own risk. So there's a question that I posted earlier, is this really an issue? Is this really a problem? Because if partners know that this is the game they're playing, they can choose to step in or out of that any day. But the reality is that the people I interviewed, they see this as an issue. So they see a need for change. They see a need for change in relationships, in structures, in narratives. They want to have open conversations. They want to step away from what this is. And in fact, people have even said financialization makes law firms like a law factory, forgetting that the actual assets in the factory are people. Because of the dictation of financial values, people-oriented metrics become less important. In fact, people have said, if you're brilliant, you can be a jerk. And yeah, nobody wants to work with jerks, not lawyers especially, but I don't think anyone. And it's also leading away from what lawyers are often, at least what I started studying law for, my duty to society. What can I mean to society? What's my place in the world? What can I protect and what can I bring forward? So financialization is not having the effect, is making people maybe richer, and that can be, it's a justified objective of people's work, but too many people are saying they're not happy. So I looked at how can you do this different? How can you approach this differently? And one of my conclusions was acknowledging all the things underneath the surface that are impacting the daily reality of a firm, impacting at individual level, group level, and systemic level. And when you acknowledge that, it's not always pretty. So you have to acknowledge maybe that you as a lawyer are more pessimistic than you thought, or that you're more insecure than you thought, or that maybe you're always arguing to win or negotiating to win, rather than actually having an open and honest conversation with someone and trying to learn from them. So there's a lot of things that you need to see about yourself that you maybe don't like seeing, but they're impacting the daily reality of law firm work. So I've also encountered people in my interviews that are doing this differently. They're reimagining a paradigm for law firms. They've actually negotiated their new normal, despite the systemic forces at all those levels that are counteracting that. So what did I learn from them, and what did I learn from the research, which is, I think, the last thing I want to also give to you as ways of, once you acknowledge that there's a lot going on in the surface and dare to look at yourself in that mirror as a firm, as a person, as a team, and take that on board as true obstacles to change. So don't just look at the part where you're bright and smart and driven as a lawyer, but also look at the parts that you don't like so much, but that are actually there and will impact your reality. If you're starting from there, what can you do? And I take some words from Petrieri, who wrote about human leadership. And he says, make room also for your body and your spirit, alongside with your intellect and your skills. And I want to invite you to tomorrow's play shop with Bruce Cryer and Hardcore Lab, where we'll also speak about these things, and we can speak about how, when bringing love and your heart to work, it's actually also a boost for your energy. A lot of different things start happening. And law firms should also be a place where we can be fully human and humanized and connected to ourselves, not just our head, but also down to our heart. And then from there, we connect to others. And lawyers, we're masters of language. So let's start using future-based language, because future-based language is generative. It transforms how situations occur to people. So if we're acutely aware of the words we use when we're speaking about the new normal that we're trying to negotiate, actually using that language, me as speaking to you and you as hearing it from me, will create change. It's generative. So I think that's what I want to leave you with. Be aware of what's going on underneath the surface, acknowledge it even if you don't like it, and from there use the strengths that you have as a lawyer, but also take inspiration from other fields to see how you can negotiate your new normal at your law firm.
Yes. And we have some questions, so I'm going to shout a little bit harder because we're in the same room. I will start with the last question that came in. Els, how do we approach changing system which seems to protect the jerk behavior in the face of the system celebrating that same person's talent/profit making abilities?
That's a very good question, and it's I think one of the big obstacles in creating this. I think the first thing that I also noticed is to know this, acknowledge it, and start having conversations about this. Because what my experience was from the interviews and my personal experience in my law firm is that we speak a lot about this, but not with the people. We don't actually dare often to have these type of conversations because there's the professional risk programming in lawyers makes it, they find it so scary, I think is the word, to sometimes sit down and have this conversation with whatever brilliant jerk is determining this. In a lot of other organizations, the behavior that these brilliant jerks have on the work floor is not tolerated to the amount that it is in law firms. So, but we need to check ourselves. If the brilliant jerk is generating so much revenue, and that is the most important driver of the people around him, he's gonna, or her, is gonna keep reinforcing the same behavior. But if we truly find it important to change that, we should also step into the conversation, address it, become aware, and also dare to speak out against this type of behavior. And not just speak about it in the hallways and at the coffee machine, or now on Zoom chats, but speak with the people involved.
Beautiful, thank you, Els. Another question. Let me see, how can new lawyers and law students approach these principles within the current firms?
Yeah, so it's not easy because like I said, there's a lot of not conscious systemic forces working against you. But I also see examples, and I saw examples when I was a young lawyer myself. If you stay very true to yourself, because that's where it starts, right? It starts with yourself. If you bring your heart to work in the way that you want to, you can enter any system, and for yourself, make sure you're doing it in the way that you are happy with. And what I've seen happen, and I've seen new successful firms being founded around these principles, is that it will also infect others in a positive way. And you can have conversations with each other on what's important. And it's not the typical conversation that these law firms are used to. So it's gonna feel strange. It's gonna feel, people are gonna be anxious about it. People are going to, the defense mechanisms that I just mentioned, you'll see them flaring up almost instantly. So you need to persist. It's not easy, it's not easy. Even when the non-conscious elements are in place, there's going to be a lot of obstacles you're going to face. But I truly feel that if people see you do it and it's authentic, you will inspire others, and you'll find people within the law firm that are driven in the same way. And you can find each other and build a coalition of people who are working in this way. And even the people who don't seem to be working in this way now, they will start to listen. They will see what you're trying to do. They see it attracts people and makes people happy. And you can ask for their time. Even as young lawyers, ask for the leadership time to say, this is truly important to us as a group, and I think it needs your attention. And we can also help you, tell you about how we're doing it. Because everyone can learn from each other. As a young lawyer, you can teach your colleagues as much as you can learn from the more experienced colleagues.
So maybe last question for you, a takeaway message. It's kind of the same, you already talked about it, but how do we really overcome the ego anxiety of the lawyer's defense mechanism to start this systemic change?
Yeah, it's, let me start, I don't want to be the pessimist lawyer here, but it's not easy. It takes also introspection of people, looking at yourself, because we all have this inside of us. It's easy for me when I interviewed to think of all these other people outside of myself who had all these qualities that were blocking the change, right? But I'm part of the system too. So I'm also not doing maybe what I could be doing, or not acknowledging what I could be acknowledging that would help the change. So it starts there, to be very aware of yourself, to reflect, to see, and this is what the ground layers of the psychoanalytic thinking, like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, what they talk about, your shadow, your dark side, the part that's inside of all of us that we maybe don't like so much, but it's really important on how our life actually goes. It drives a lot of our behavior. And lawyers, I think they have an extra handicap because they're so head-based, and their job is to make sense and to rationalize and to argument, that they sometimes forget that there's a lot of things that are not rationalizable, that they're hard to explain. So I think it starts with accepting that that's the fact, and maybe also learning a little bit more about that by reading from completely different fields than what you're used to, or listening to a podcast about it, and then look inside yourself. And when you start doing that, also invite others to do the same and start a conversation from a completely different level.
Last but not least, one question left and 3 minutes to go. How do you see these systemic changes in law firms affecting the world?
Yes, so what I see, there's a firm that just actually incorporated only a few months ago in Amsterdam. And I know a couple of them because they came from the firm I also worked with. And I visited them, and they said, we've worked for big corporate clients because we were a big firm. And that's important work. It needs to be done. It needs to be done well. And it doesn't have to be a pro bono type of operation. I mean, that's a commercial operation. But they said, we want our skill level and our experience to also be available to a completely different type of client. So they say, we just have, and this is a very simple example, but our rates adjust depending on what type of client we have, but they should get the same quality. And then I think you're taking big steps closer to what is your role as a lawyer in the world? What can you add to the world? What should be the future of law? And it's also, I think, as a lawyer, not to be reactive and to respond to things, but to be proactive. What did you want to be when you grew up and you chose law? And why did you choose law? And is that still present in your daily work? And if it's not, how can you bring it back? Because that often is the passion and the heart that you brought to your own, like what you wanted to be professionally. So I think there's many ways. I think the societal role of lawyers is very important. And I think that will almost automatically have an impact on how happy lawyers are within their own firm.
Beautiful. So I'm going to step in, and it's the last. So stay there. Thank you, Els, for this wonderful talk. We at the end of her talk bring the heart back in law firms. So we're going to transition now into the transition lounge. I'm going to host that session. So I hope you stick with me and join me in the transition lounge. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.